Okay, welcome to part three. This is what I entitle 4 Years Later. So, the first person that we get introduced to in this part of the narrative, so this is between 1823 and 1827. So, there's 4 years. And the angel Moroni tells Joseph, hey, why don't you come back here every single year? We're going to have some communication. I'm assuming some training on a few things, but he's supposed to go back every single year. So, in those 4 years, again, their condition has not improved. So they're still very poor. They're still working tirelessly about things. They can't really stop working. In fact, in a lot of the accounts that I've read, it's like I went and got the plates, came back, did my chores, and then moved on with it. I mean, they just couldn't stop. They did not have the means to stop. This is the only way that they could live. So this man by the name of Josiah Stoll comes into the picture. And draft 3, so this is Howard Corey's draft of the whole Joseph Smith history, says that there was believed to be what's called a Spaniard discovery of a silver mine. So apparently some Spaniards from, again, Spain, apparently there was a silver mine that they were doing, and Josiah Stoll wanted to get some people who were willing to work and go find the mine. And they worked at it for about a month, and it didn't really go anywhere. So this is elsewhere in the state of New York. This is a little bit more upstate New York. And so Joseph Sr. and Joseph Smith, as far as we know, went and worked for Josiah Stoll to try to find a silver mine that never actually came to pass. So they gave it a good heave-ho for about a month. What's interesting about this is there is a footnote here from the Joseph Smith papers and kind of a fun article that came way later in the Daily Tribune of Salt Lake, which I think might have become later the Salt Lake Tribune. I don't know if it really matters much, but it was in a newspaper in Salt Lake City. So note 65 from the history drafts between kind of like drafts 2 and 3 in volume 1 of the histories. It says, quote, Joseph Smith acknowledged receiving wages of $14 per month from Stoll for his assistance in treasure seeking. Additionally, Joseph Smith and his father purportedly were parties to a contract regarding shares in the distribution of any valuables that they found. So there were two things. Number one, I'm going to pay you for the labor that you do. And number two, you're going to get a cut of whatever we find. And that agreement, believe it or not, actually shows up in a newspaper in Salt Lake City here. And if you want to, you can read through that. At the end of the article, it's funny. It basically says, this guy sent this to us. It might have been by accident, but we're going to publish it anyway. So that's the agreement. And it could have been, and I didn't really dive too deep into that. It could have been anti-Mormonistic. It's like, oh, he was just a treasure seeker and here's proof that he did and all this kind of stuff. And so digging up plates out of the ground was just part of his fantasy. Or it could have just been like, hey, an interesting account. Here's for you to read. So either way, I don't know if it matters. It's the truth as it stands. Apparently that was the agreement that they made. Never happened. Nothing came of it. They never found anything, gave it up after a month. However, Josiah Stoll lives close to Isaac Hale and his family. And Isaac Hale has a daughter by the name of Emma Hale. And they have a friend by the name of Zechariah Tarbell. And so why do all those matter? Well, Joseph meets and falls in love with Emma. And there is a small account where Joseph was still kind of in mourning about Alvin, and so found a lot of personal solace in quite a remarkable woman. I mean, the Smiths couldn't say enough good about her. And if you know anything about the history of the church, she is an enormous influence for good. Writes our first hymn book. She's a part of the Female Relief Society. Loses children in childbirth, or shortly thereafter, quite frequently. I mean, she just is an incredible figure. And Joseph Smith falls in love, and they get married in the home of this guy against the wishes of their parents. So they don't really like the stories. They don't really like the fact that he's up in their neighborhood treasure seeking, and he's a stranger to them. And so their parents were not into the idea. Isaac Hale actually speaks out a lot against the Smith family and against the whole Angel Moroni and the early foundations of the church and all that kind of stuff. Again, something that would make a lot of sense to me. I'm not going to trash on that too much because, under the circumstances, it does actually make sense. So some people would say that they eloped. You can say they got married. Again, a little different interpretations. However, I think they're both very accurate if you want to go there. So he meets and marries Emma Hale. They get married in South Bainbridge, New York, by Squire Tarbell, is how Draft 2 calls it. Now, Squire Tarbell is Zachariah Tarbell, a justice of the peace, and hence the title squire. Okay. And from a document that I found called Regional Studies in Latter-day Saint Church History, it says that they lived about 4 miles from Stoll's house, Josiah Stoll's house, treasure seeker guy. The site is now part of the Afton Fairgrounds. So if you're in, South Bainbridge, go to the Afton Fairgrounds. Today, a historical marker on the site of the Tarbell home, erected in 1932 by the New York State Department of Education, mistakenly identifies Emma as Emily Hale. It reads, Mormon House, Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, was married in this house January 18th, 1827 to Emily Hale, which is actually Emma Hale. So they get married, and since the Hale family is not really into this, they leave almost immediately after that and go back to Palmyra, where Joseph works with his father on the farm. There's not a whole lot of documentation from the papers. There's a lot of other things out there, but I'm just focusing on the papers about Isaac Hale and his family's response to it. So I dug around a little further in the papers and actually found Emma's patriarchal blessing, when she gets a patriarchal blessing. Now, this is something that is still practiced today. There are still patriarchs today, or sometimes we call them evangelists. But a patriarch is, it used to be a church-wide calling, but now is a stake-wide calling, where you will go and receive a patriarch as a calling in the church. And this man will give you a blessing, tell you what your lineage is, and he'll tell you perhaps a little bit about your past, a little bit about your future. It's considered scripture, and it's actually held in the archives of the church. So these are very important blessings that are given to everyone. I have one. My wife has one. My mother has one. My grandmother has one. And these are very sacred documents and very sacred blessings in Latter-day Saint church culture. And so Emma's very touching. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because I get very emotional reading hers. Because later on it goes into some of the babies that she's lost. And it's just very touching. Anyway, this is Joseph Smith's father towards Emma. So I think it's hard to separate them. I think there's a lot of love there between the Smith family and Emma. And I'm hoping to convey that here, but also to maybe explain the feelings that they had at the time about the Hale family. So Emma's patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr. says, Thou hast grieved for the hardness of the hearts of thy father's house, and thou hast longed for their salvation. The Lord will have respect to thy cries, and by his judgments he will cause some of them to see their folly and repent of their sins. But it will be by affliction that they will be saved. So to give you kind of a sense of maybe how bitter that got. Oliver Cowdery was actually a party to a couple of agreements between Isaac Hale and Joseph Smith, which we'll get into in a later episode. And he writes, quote, while employed here, he became acquainted with the family of Isaac Hale, to whom you read in several of the publications of those who have sought to destroy the validity of the Book of Mormon. It may be necessary hereafter to refer you more particularly to the conduct of his family, as their influence has been considerably exerted to destroy the reputation of our brother. I believe he means Joseph Smith. Probably because he married a daughter of the same, contrary to some of their wishes, and in connection with this, to certain statements of some others of the inhabitants of that section of the country. So the guy didn't have a good reputation, and he married their daughter without consent. And so, yeah, I think that's all very reasonable, that they would not have a good relationship. There was a footnote in draft 2 in the Joseph Smith papers. It says, quote, Isaac Hale wrote later that he told Joseph Smith his reasons for refusing to consent to the marriage, some of which were that he was a stranger and followed a business that I could not approve, apparently referring to Joseph Smith's involvement with treasure seeking. And that's pretty much all you get about Isaac Hale in the Joseph Smith papers. We get some receipts, we get some agreements, signed documents in 1829 and 1830. That's later on, so we're not going to get into that now, but that's all you get. So apparently there was some tension there. So years have gone by. Joseph's now married. He's about 20, and he goes for his 4th visit. And like I said, in the history that we read about in the Pearl of Great Price, it is agreed upon that 4 years is going to be the time frame. So the Wentworth letter says, after having received many visits from the angels of God, unfolding the majesty and glory of the events that should transpire in the last days, on the morning of the 22nd of September, 1827, the angel of the Lord delivered the records into my hands. So that is 4 years to the day. So again, splitting hairs if you like, but it sounds like, he had his vision on the 21st overnight, tells his dad on the 22nd, goes straight to the hill, according to draft 2 that we usually read. And then 4 years, like 1827, September 22nd, that day is when he gets to actually retrieve the plates and, start translating is the idea. We get a description of the plates in the Wentworth letter. These records were engraven on plates which had the appearance of gold. Each plate was 6 inches wide and 8 inches long, and not so thick as common tin. They were filled with engravings in Egyptian characters and bound together in a volume as the leaves of a book, with 3 rings running through the whole. The volume was something near 6 inches in thickness, a part of which was sealed. The characters on the unsealed part were small and beautifully engraved. The whole book exhibited many marks of antiquity in its construction and much skill in the art of engraving. So apparently the font size is very small. Take that description, copy-paste it into Rupp's account in the book that he writes, copy-paste that into Orson Pratt's interesting account, which is a tract that goes all over Europe. That's the description. So you're going to see a lot of replicas. I mean, people even sell these. You can find them on Etsy. A lot of them are not actually to scale, but, metal plates, about thickness is 10. There are some people out there I've seen which show that the characters are actually quite tiny. And so there's a lot of text on each page. Even though there is a sealed portion, we still get as many pages as we do get out of the Book of Mormon. So that's that. Then we get into, now that the plates and the items that are in that box come out of the box, we start getting some more descriptions, which is why I've waited to the description of the rest of it until now. So that's the plates. That's the gold plates. Urim and Thummim. Lots of stuff here, so forgive me for a second. There's some fascinating stuff about this. So again, Urim and Thummim is a Hebrew set of words, light and perfections, or other such close interpretations of that. Anyway, we get a description from the Times and Seasons. This is, again, a church newspaper from long ago. With the records was found a curious instrument which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. And I looked all over the place. There's a lot of various sites. There was one that I liked. It was called Priesthood on Judaism, and they actually copy a lot of their work into Wikipedia. So again, amateur historian is now going to go to Wikipedia. And I like this interpretation because a lot of really good, I think this one's a well-researched article, and I think it's done by a legitimate group. So thank you to whoever you are, Priesthood in Judaism. Thank you very much. This says, the description of the clothing of the Hebrew high priest in the book of Exodus portrays the Urim and Thummim as being put into the sacred breastplate worn by the high priest over the ephod. Where the biblical text elsewhere describes the ephod being used, scholars presume that it is referring to the use of the Urim and Thummim in conjunction with the ephod, as it seems to be intimately connected with it. Similarly, where non-prophets are portrayed as asking God for guidance, and the advice is not described as given by visions, scholars think that Urim and Thummim were the medium implied. So just to say that anciently, sort of Talmudic and rabbinical tradition and scholarship says that for some reason this Urim and Thummim is tied to a breastplate-like object, and those are used in conjunction with each other. Going further into that, according to classical rabbinical literature, in order for the Urim and Thummim to give an answer, it was first necessary for the individuals to stand facing the fully dressed high priest and vocalize the question briefly in a simple way, though it was not necessarily for it to be loud enough for anyone else to hear. Someone explains that the high priest would stand facing the Ark of the Covenant with the inquirer behind him, facing the priest's back. After the inquirer asked his question, the Holy Spirit would immediately overcome the priest, and he would see the letters protruding in a prophetic vision. The Talmudic rabbis argued that the Urim and Thummim were words written on the sacred breastplate. And there's a description of that. If you don't know, there are 12 stones on the ephod. And the idea is that the Urim and Thummim would project words onto the stones themselves, which is kind of strange because there's more Hebrew letters than there were stones on the ephod. So not sure how that worked. But apparently they were projected onto the breastplate somehow. And then the priest would be able to read them in his own language. All that to say, that's very similar to how Joseph apparently was seeing. He would look into this breastplate object idea, and he would be able to see the answers to his questions and that we get in the Doctrine and Covenants, and he would also be able to translate the Book of Mormon into English. There's some apocryphal writings that I couldn't find, and so I'm not going to include them, but they are also implying that if he didn't know how something sounded, he would just spell out the letters. And there's a lot of instances where he doesn't go back and say, okay, where were we? He would just go back into, he put on this Urim and Thummim apparatus and just keep going. So there was never any proofreading. There was never any going back. And in some cases, apparently, if the words would appear and the scribe would write them down, Martin Harris, Emma Smith, even Oliver Cowdery, and if they didn't get it right or something like that, it would just kind of stay there. And he would just kind of keep at it until they got it right, never looking at them, and then continue going on. So again, what he's describing is very interesting because it matches what I found here in this Priesthood in Judaism article that I found on Wikipedia. The only other time that we get Urim and Thummim language outside of the Old Testament and the Doctrine and Covenants is in the Book of Abraham in the Pearl of Great Price. And that says, "And I, Abraham, had the Urim and Thummim, which the Lord my God had given unto me in Ur of the Chaldees." And that's how Abraham apparently received some of his revelations as well. So again, that's in the Book of Abraham. That's a Latter-day Saint scripture that's placed in the Pearl of Great Price, translated from papyrus, much later on in the story. So we won't get into that too much here. This idea of Urim and Thummim actually gets a little confusing. So he starts calling, Joseph Smith and others start calling other things Urim and Thummim. So it's not just two specific stones fastened to the rim of a bow, so forth and so on. There's a William Clayton journal excerpt that later becomes what we now call Doctrine and Covenants, section 30. And it describes the entire earth will one day become a Urim and Thummim. So just to kind of give a full explanation of what this term means, this is what we have, which is now, again, I'm just going to read it from William Clayton's journal, but it's now a section of the Doctrine and Covenants. It says, "But there is no angel ministers to this earth, only what either does belong or has belonged to this earth. And the angels do not reside on a planet like our earth, but they dwell with God, and the planet where he dwells is like crystal, and like a sea of glass before the throne. This is the great Urim and Thummim, whereon all things are manifest, both things past, present, and future, and are continually before the Lord. The Urim and Thummim is a small representation of this globe. The earth, when it is purified, will be made like unto crystal, and will be a Urim and Thummim, whereby all things pertaining to an inferior kingdom, or all kingdoms of a lower order, will be manifest to those who dwell on it. And this earth will be with Christ. Then the white stone mentioned in Revelation chapter 2, verse 7, is the Urim and Thummim, whereby all things pertaining to a higher order of kingdoms, even all kingdoms, will be made known, and the white stone is given to each of those who come into this, the celestial kingdom, whereon is a new name written, which no man knoweth, save he that receiveth it. The new name is a key word." So this kind of goes back to what, again, priesthood and some of the Judaistic writings are saying, is that these stones were also engraven. They had words on them. And you can even, some people Etsy these, you can buy these, where it has a Hebrew form of Urim and Thummim on two stones. And in this case, what we're basically saying is that there's Urim and Thummims all over the place. And so because of that, what you get is the seer stone, which This object was actually published when they printed out the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, which again is a very rare move for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because this is an artifact, and we don't really put a whole lot of stock into like objects and artifacts like that. But in this case, this apparently is the seer stone that Joseph also used to translate the Book of Mormon. So apparently, according to Joseph, one interpretation of Urim and Thummim is the spectacles. Again, you can kind of see here a breastplate looking through and translating into English. The other one is he would place this seer stone into a hat to kind of crowd out the light, so to speak, and be able to read things from the stone, and the scribe would write them down. There's also instances sometimes where maybe Joseph himself could consider himself a Urim and Thummim, because there's some instances, and it's depicted in films, where he's just reading off the text of the gold plates, and in some cases even that he just kind of walks around the room and speaks. So pretty generous with this term. I think for our purposes, in our time, I should say, we call the Urim and Thummim the clear glass, the breastplate object. Then we have a seer stone. Then we have, just Joseph being a translator, a revelator, a prophet and a seer. And then, him walking around the room could be considered that. We try to delineate those just so it's not so confusing. Anyway, so there you go. So I got this one from churchofjesuschrist.org about Lucy Mack Smith. It says she was an eyewitness to the events surrounding the Book of Mormon translation and testified that she hefted the plates and handled the Urim and Thummim. And so because I found that on the church's website, and I found this in the Joseph Smith papers, this is a description from Mother Smith. And I think this is where a lot of people get their ideas about what the Urim and Thummim that was in the same box as the gold plates is. She says, and I'm going to back up a little. This is a really wonderful story. So something horrible had happened. I'm not going to get into it too much for the sake of time, but something horrible had happened, and Lucy was trying to keep it together. And she had to kind of go into the next room to try to keep her emotions together. And she was very emotional, so she leaves the room and goes into another room. And so Joseph Smith follows her into the other room because he's trying to attend to his mother. I just think that's wonderful. And then she says this. Mother, said he, do not be uneasy. All is right. See here, said he, I have got the key. I know not what he meant, but he took the article in my hands, and after examining it, with no covering but a silk handkerchief, found that it consisted of 2 smooth, 3-cornered diamonds set in glass, and the glass was set in silver bows. Stones connected with each other in the same way that old-fashioned spectacles are made. So if you're wondering where that image comes from, I believe it's from Lucy Mack Smith's history. So she actually got to feel them and describe them. And then there's some other items that we get out of what he takes out of, his 4th visit out of the stone box. This one is noted in section 17, and as a side note, it's kind of interesting. Section 17 does not appear in Revelation Book 1. It's only in Revelation Book 2. Apparently, it was copied over into Revelation Book 2, and it's a good thing, because if they didn't, we wouldn't have it. Apparently, it was removed from Revelation Book 1 and never put back, so it's gone from that book. Anyway, section 17, this is canonized in our scriptures, says that there was also the sword of Laban, and I really don't get anything else out of any of these books about the sword of Laban. I'm very sorry. You can look up various depictions of what people thought it looked like, but not really much there. Then we get a breastplate. Again, Lucy Mack Smith gives us a description. When he returned, he requested me to come downstairs. And I love this. I told him I could not leave my work just then, but as he still insisted, I finally concluded to go down and see what he wanted. I love that. He's like, hey, Mom, can you come downstairs? Mom, come downstairs. Come down right now. I got to show you something. Again, we're all still just people. I love it. Anyway, I digress. After upon meeting him, he handed me the breastplate spoken of in his history. It was wrapped in a thin muslin handkerchief, so thin that I could see the glistening metal and ascertain or feel its proportions without any difficulty. It was concave on one side and convex on the other, and extended from the neck downwards as far as the center of the stomach of a man of extraordinary size. It had 4 straps of the same material for the purpose of fastening it to the breast, 2 of which ran back to go over the shoulders, and the other 2 were designed to fasten to the hips. These straps were just the width of my 2 fingers, for I measured them, and they had holes in the end of them for convenience in fastening. The whole plate was worth at least $500. Scratch that out. Which plate, together with the Urim and Thummim, Joseph placed, and the Urim and Thummim, in the chest after I examined it. So I don't know if these 2 instances of feeling these objects happened at the same time, but apparently there was a box or a chest made that he sort of placed all these objects into it. The other thing that we get, again, from Revelation Book 2 is that the directors are in there as well. And we interpret that as the Liahona, so there was a compass-like object given to Lehi when him and his family leave Jerusalem 600 years before Christ is born. And it helps them go through the wilderness. Apparently that object, that Liahona, or the director, the ball and directors, whatever those may look like, are also in the box, and Joseph has those as well. So from Revelation Book 2, we see, "Behold, I say unto you that you must rely upon my word, which if you do with full purpose of heart, you shall have a view of the breastplate, and also the breastplate, the sword of Laban, Urim and Thummim, which was given to the brother of Jared upon the mount when he talked with the Lord face to face, and the marvelous directors, which was given to Lehi while in the wilderness on the borders of the Red Sea, and it is by your faith that you shall obtain a view of them." So there's a clarification here. We talked a lot about the Urim and Thummim in Hebrew tradition. These are not the same ones. So wherever those are, we don't really know. There's a lot of rabbinical tradition that they either stopped working or were lost entirely. But in this case, this is talking about 2 stones that were handed to the brother of Jared, I believe on a place called Mount Zerin. This is coming out of the Book of Ether in our Book of Mormon, where the brother of Jared comes to the Lord with some stones to touch so that they can have light in vessels as they cross the ocean for about a year. It takes about a year for that trip to happen. And he goes up with 16 stones and comes back with 2 extras. And the 2 extras are what they call interpreters, and whoever uses those is called a seer. So if you're curious, these are not like somehow taken from the Middle East. These apparently were given to the brother of Jared on sort of the Asiatic continent, European continent. We're not really sure where the boat left, but yeah, apparently the Urim and Thummim that is in the possession of Joseph Smith at this point is from that instance. So those stones traveled to America by boat and stayed there, and we can maybe they're still around somewhere on this continent, but that's what we're talking about here. We do see an instance of other records. So David Whitmer, who is one of the 3 witnesses, told several interviewers in the 1870s and 1880s that he saw additional items on this occasion. Most of these later accounts listed the gold plates, the interpreters, or Urim and Thummim, the sword of Laban, the directors, Liahona, and additional records. In some, Whitmer also mentioned the breastplate. So apparently there might have been some other objects in the box. There's once again a warning. When Joseph retrieves all this stuff, there's once again a warning that says people are going to try to take these from you. They're going to try to kill you. They're trying to get the gold. They're going to try to get rich. They're going to try to discredit you. You have to be careful about this, right? So that's it. That's a lot for that. But just to give you some examples of apparently the things that Joseph took with him, or maybe left in the box. But the 3 witnesses were able to see these objects, and Mother Smith and others were able to maybe kind of see these objects. But he never, as far as we know, maybe Oliver Cowdery used the Urim and Thummim when he did some translation, which we see in section 9 of the Doctrine and Covenants as we currently have it. But otherwise, pretty much the plates and the rest of the objects were mostly kept hidden for a while during the translation process. So then we get, almost immediately after that happens, the persecution, because they start finding out about plates of gold and all this stuff. Everybody just kind of goes nuts on them. And so they need to leave, but they're way too poor. So again, Joseph's just been married. He got booted out of there. He comes back to his father. He works with him for a while. He gets the plates. And then again, things become so unbearable. And this man named Martin Harris shows up. Now, he's been in the neighborhood longer than them. He's been there since 1793. So he's been in Palmyra area. It used to be called... Swift's Landing. So he's been there for 34 years. He's been there a long time. Prominent farmer. He's from the same neighborhood. There's a kind of a People's Glossary in the Joseph Smith papers, and it says this. He says he moved with his parents to the area of Swift's Landing, which is later in Palmyra, Ontario County, New York. In 1793, married his first cousin, Lucy Harris, on the 27th of March, 1808, in Palmyra. He served in the War of 1812 in the New York militia. Thought that was interesting. I didn't know that. Became a landowner of some 320 acres at Palmyra. So this is a very prominent farmer. He, just so that you know, he paid the printing costs for the publication of the Book of Mormon in 1830 through the sale of 151 of his acres of land. So he still had plenty left over. And needless to say, his wife was not into that idea. We'll get to that later in another episode. What's also really fun about this guy is he was baptized into the church 3 times. He was baptized into the church when he became a member on the April 6th, 1830, when the church was organized. He was one of the founding members and one of the 3 witnesses. So he was part of actually choosing the apostles. This is a very prominent person in the church at the time. Again, funded it. I think gave $5,000 to print 3,000 copies of the Book of Mormon. He is excommunicated in December of 1837. And then he is rebaptized into the church in Kirtland in 1842. So during Joseph's lifetime, Martin Harris is baptized, excommunicated, and rebaptized. Then he gets involved with some of the offshoot groups, not the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but some other, I won't get into the details of it, but other faiths that also sort of believed in Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. So in essence, he kind of leaves. I don't have a record of him being excommunicated from that, but he migrates to the Utah Valley in 1870. He's rebaptized into the church in 1870. And that is not uncommon. Most of the members of the church, as I've read in the Journal of Discourses, are rebaptized once they get to Utah, not because they're excommunicated. I believe even Brigham Young was rebaptized. It's just, I think they just recommitted to their covenants, is to put it in my language, and forgive me if that's too simplistic. And then he dies in Clarkston, Cache County, Utah Territory. So he is buried in the state of Utah, in Cache County. So that's who he is. Now, why all that? He gives Joseph and Eva $50 so that they can make it to Harmony, Pennsylvania. And then while they're there, because he knows that where they are, assists with scribal work. And what we call the Book of Lehi is translated. Now, we call it that, and we've never read it because the 116 pages of that translation were lost. And most of the early sections of the Doctrine and Covenant have to do with being naughty and losing those pages and the very harsh punishments that come upon that. But this is a very, very influential person. So as far as we know from our records, Emma Smith is now helping translate some of these 116 pages. Martin Harris comes down. He also scribes 116 pages. And a lot of this because Joseph just frankly doesn't know how to write some of these words, and his penmanship isn't so great. So they're helping him do it. And that's where we're going to stop on that because the actual translation comes later. Oliver Cowdery enters the picture later. I am not going to get into that quite yet because we'll just go on and on and on. Like I said, there's a lot of rabbit holes we can go down. But that is kind of where we stop. Those are the 4 years coming to an end. And then there's a very interesting account of what I call Mr. Harris Goes to New York, where they try to get some legitimacy behind this so that people stop all the persecution and the violence that is being levied towards this family and towards Joseph Smith. So that's part 3, a lot to do with what was buried in the Hill Cumorah. And in part 4, we're going to be talking about some efforts to, in my phrase, legitimize this project that they're doing.